to the latest episode of the PokePopCast. Today we're going to be talking about end-of-match resolutions, including concessions, ties, and the little understood gentleman's agreement or informal agreements as they're officially called now. This is based on a professor seminar that I participated in at the Atlantic City Regional back at the end of September this year, 2019. I was one of the presenters, and this was my topic. I'm going to cover most of the same things here, although I'm also going to be giving some information more for players as well. Okay, so while my focus is judges, I also want to make sure I'm giving information that players can use as well. So hopefully you find this useful. This should help explain what things can be done and what things can't be done at the end of a match resolution. Okay, let's get started. Most of the information that I'm going to be covering here is based on information that's in the official general event rules, Pokemon trading card game general event rules, or actually it's both trading card game and video game. Section 11 talks about end of match resolution, and we'll talk about the different points that are covered in that section. So first off, I won't spend any time on the main way of ending a match, which is through somebody winning the games, either one game in a single game match or 2 out of 3 games in a best 2 out of 3 match. Those are standard. Even a tie is standard. If players haven't come to any other type of resolution, you're either going to have a win, lose, or tie. What we want to talk about here are the less understood ways that a match can end. So let's start with section 11.1, intentional draws. There's no intentional draws in the video game, and that's because it's very hard, almost impossible, not impossible, but almost impossible to play to a draw in the video game, whereas it's very easy. If players wish to draw, they can play out a game to the end of time and result in a draw. So rather than make everybody sit there for whatever the length of time is that the game requires, they're allowed to come to an agreement to draw early on. Okay, so players are allowed to draw. What is an ID? What's okay to do? What's not okay to do? So if you make an offer of an ID, and that's pretty much what it is, it's an offer. You can only offer things. You can't ask for things. You get into problems when you ask for things. You can't ask for a concession. You can't. So judges here now, don't get bogged down in semantics. If somebody says, can we draw? Can we ID? I would like to ID with you. I'd like you to ID. Don't jump on that, oh, they didn't say offer, therefore I am now going to DQ these players or that player. Look at the meaning of what they said. Okay, the meaning of the words is they're going to get to the end result of an intentional draw. Pokemon is not a gotcha where, oh, you used the wrong phrase, therefore now we're going to DQ you. They were doing something that was legal, intentionally drawing. They may not have phrased it exactly the way Pokemon wanted it phrased, but the meaning was the same. Don't DQ someone over semantics. Now, one thing that is important with intentional draws is you can only offer once. If you make an offer to somebody and they decline, you cannot offer again or ask them again. Now, toward that end, I will say to players and judges especially, if it's a matter of them explaining to the other player what the intentional draw is and why they would want to do it, that's not asking them multiple times. That's them merely explaining what's going on. Okay? So again, we're not looking for gotcha situations. We're not looking to get someone on semantics. There's only one request. It may be followed up with an explanation, and if that truly is an explanation, not a pressure, but an explanation of what the situation is and what's legal and why they would want to do it, that's fine as long as it doesn't drag out into some long situation. Again, don't hit someone for what you think is a violation when it's not really a violation. They're merely explaining, because not everybody knows what an intentional draw is, right? You have to learn sometime. One thing I will state though is don't allow a lie. Okay, now there's a range of things where there's omissions. They may not say, oh, you're only 5'2", you may not make it in, so they may not state that, and not stating something is not a lie. But if they were to say, oh, all the 5'2s are going to make it in, don't worry about it, ID, all 5'2s are going to make it in, that's now a lie. Because not all 5'2s are going to make it in. There's always at least one 5'2 or X2, depending on how many rounds there are in the tournament, that don't make it in. So, see my last video. There's no lying in Pokemon. There's no lying when you're asking for an ID either. Okay, so that's not allowed. Don't allow that. So related to the ID is a concession. Concessions and IDs are pretty similar, but there's a bit of a difference, because if you say, let's ID, I want you to give me an ID, I offer you an ID, they all pretty much have the same meaning. But if you are doing now with a concession and they say, you can offer, a player can offer a concession, I will concede to you. Your father with your kid, you're going to concede to your kid. Your buddy's chasing points, you want to concede to him. I'm giving you a concession. That's great. You can, but as soon as you now turn it around into, I want you to give me a concession, that now, see, an ID is two players getting an equal result. A concession is one player's getting a good result, one player's getting a bad result. So you can offer a concession, but a player cannot ask for a concession. Now, there's a little bit of confusion on this in this particular area as well, where the penalty guidelines talk about asking multiple times for a concession being treated as coercion, which would lead to a disqualification. Now, some judges, and I think some players, misread that to think, oh, so asking multiple times is a DQ, therefore asking once is just fine. No, that's not what that is saying. It's saying, and if you read the entire section of the penalty guidelines, it says a player cannot ask for a concession. Period. That's your first sentence. So that's not allowed. Then in the second sentence says, if you ask for it multiple times, this can be coercion and can lead to a DQ. So that's saying, hey, this asking multiple times is really bad. But asking once is still bad. So asking for a concession even once is a penalty. It's not a DQ, but it's a penalty. Okay? So, how big of a penalty? I leave that to some of the discretion of the judges, depending on the experience of the players and the age of the players and the level of the tournament. But I will state that if you're at a regional and you're asking for a concession, you're getting a game loss at least. And I think in a lot of other level tournaments, that's a fair penalty for asking for a concession. It is not allowed. So instead of getting a concession, you're getting a game loss. Okay? For a long time, this was called gentlemen's agreements, or as they are calling them in the rule books now, informal agreements. And the reason they're called informal agreements is because Pokemon and judges cannot enforce the results of these agreements. Okay? But let's be clear, just because Pokemon is not enforcing the result of the agreement does not make the agreement illegal. That's very important. There's a big difference between something that is illegal and something that is allowed but not enforced. So, let's talk about informal agreements. Basically, an informal agreement that is allowed, let's actually jump ahead and then we'll come back. random determination. Random means is not allowed. That's section 11.3. Random means is not allowed to determine the result of a match. So we'll talk a little bit more about random means, but what informal agreements are now is, aside from normal gameplay, it is something that is not a random determination that is used to determine the result of a match. Why do players want to do these informal agreements? Because players hate ties. When you get to close to having the number of points you need to make the top cut or make day 2 at a regional, the difference between a tie and a win quite often is the difference between making it and not making it. So two players playing will be 2 or 3 points away from making it, and if they lose, they know neither, or if they tie, they know neither player is going to make it. Certainly if one player loses, but then the other player makes it, so that's a better result from the player's point of view versus both of them getting taken out of the running. So why do players, so how do players come to an agreement to end a match in a way that is other than a tie or a concession? So number one, it has to be non-random. Non-random, a common way that players do this is they will say, okay, whoever's ahead on prizes gets the win. If in game 3, we're game 3 at the end of the match, rather than tie and we both get taken out of contention, if one player's ahead on prizes than the other player, then the player who's taken more prizes in that game, we're going to agree that they win that game and therefore get the points and move on. Okay? That's legal to do because that is not a random determination. So that, I think, is pretty clear for people nowadays. Where I think some people still get a little confused is another potential way that people come to this agreement is board state. Because players say, well, okay, he may be ahead on prizes. On my next turn, I'm going to take 4 prizes and win the game, even though he was ahead on prizes, and therefore my board state is better, so I should win the game. So some players prefer to make the agreement based on board state. And while board state is a very subjective measure, it is not random. Okay, it's not as clear-cut as he's ahead on prizes, I'm behind on prizes, he wins. There's a certain analysis that has to be done, and to be honest, I don't recommend that players use board state because I've watched a number of players at the end of match, and I don't know if I ever think of players that agreed on board state. Maybe a couple of times if it was really clear. But even then, I've seen situations where the board state was clearly in one player's favor and the other player was like, yeah, but I got a Cynthia and that was going to draw me into everything I needed to turn the game around, and they just can't come to an agreement. So while it's not illegal, I highly recommend that players don't do board state because it just I've seen a lot of hurt feelings over it, and I haven't really seen it work well. But judges, if players do agree to it, it's legal to do, but again, you can't enforce it. So if they make the agreement and at the end of the match they can't come to agreement with who has the better board state, then they need to sign as a tie. And again, they're not allowed a long period of time to come to an agreement on this. They can be allowed a short period of time to analyze what the situation is, but if it drags on to any length of time, then it's like, hey guys, you need to sign this match slip because it's end of round and we need to get the next round going. You're not allowed to sit here talking for a half hour arguing your case. You can't come to a decision, then it's a tie. All right? So what else we got? So the next grouping, we touched on it for a moment when we were talking about informal agreements, is random, determining the game by random means, section 11.3. This is just really, really not allowed. and is a really quick way to get disqualified from the tournament. There's just no two ways around it. Players, don't do it. You're not allowed to do it. Getting caught is really, really bad. It's a disqualification. And I've seen players banned over things, especially if it's happened multiple times. It's really not worth doing. It may seem like it in the moment because you really want to move on to the next stage in the tournament, but it's not worth getting kicked out of the tournament, losing everything, because that's really what's going to happen a lot of the time. Local events, judges at local events, I know you don't qualify players over this, over any of these things, right? But you really need to, you're doing a disservice to your local players if you don't make it clear to them how bad doing some of these things are that are not allowed, like asking for concessions or dice rolls or anything that's not explicitly not allowed, because while you may be letting them get away with it at your event, they're going to have a hammer come down on their head when they do it somewhere else, and now they've got a really horrible experience that you led them into because you gave them a false sense of security that it was okay. So judges, that's on you if you're letting players do that. I hate to come down like that on judges, but you need to do things right. If you don't do things right, you're doing your players a disservice. You're not doing them any kind of favor by making them think that they're getting away with stuff, because they get away with it up until they don't get away with it, and then it's a horrible outcome for them. Don't do it. Okay, so the last point of this that I want to talk about is bribery, section 11.4, bribery, which I'm also going to talk a little bit about prize splitting here. Bribery obviously is not allowed. I mentioned earlier about quid pro quo. If there's any offer of, I'll give you the win if you give me the mat, or I don't want the points, you can take the points, give me the prizes, that's bribery, because you're offering something to get something else. That's literally the definition of bribery, and bribery is a disqualification and a forfeit of all prizes and points, and quite likely can lead to a ban. Again, the potential gain is vastly outweighed by the potential penalty here. There's also been some discussion of prize splits, and players talking about, well, we're going to play things out normally, but we're just going to agree to split prizes at the end. There's not clear directive here, but I would highly recommend players not do these things, and highly recommend to judges that they not allow players to do it, because number one, championship points can't be split. So whatever's being split, someone's getting a little, and a play mat, if you're talking about a cup, can't be split. So somebody's getting a little more of one thing and somebody's getting a little more of another thing, and now you're in the exact situation of what a bribe is. I would say that if players really, really want to think about doing it, they talk to staff and outline to staff what they're proposing, and make sure they're not setting themselves into a situation where they're both going to get DQ'd. That's about all I can say on it right now, because we don't really have strong guidance on that, but if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it really sounds like a duck to me. I would not allow it at any of my events. It really stinks of bribery, and a small, just like cheating a little bit is still cheating. Bribing a little bit is still bribing, and the guidelines don't talk about little bribes being different penalties than big bribes. It's bribery. So I hate to leave on a kind of a amorphous note there, because, like I said, we don't have clear guidance. But if anyone's going to do anything in that area, talk with your staff at the event and make sure you're not going to set yourself into a situation where you're going to have a lot of trouble down the line. Okay, so we did cover a lot of good things, though, a lot of things that are clear-cut that people don't seem to think are, right? So all these concessions and intentional draws and informal agreements. So we covered all that. There was a lot of confusion on that. And I think hopefully we cleared all that up for you. Now we got this little area of prize splitting, which don't do it. But I can't tell you that it's against the rules per se, because, like I said, guidance is not clear. But I don't recommend it, and I would not allow it. And that's about all I can say on that. So that's it for this episode of the PokePopCast. Hope to see you again soon, and take care. Have a happy holidays.